Welcome to the Orthogonal Bet, where we explore the weird and wonderful ideas that shape our world. It's a cabinet of curiosities for the ears and the mind. I'm your host, Samuel Arbisman, complexity scientist, author, and scientist in residence at Lux Capital. In this episode, I speak with Chaim Gingold, a game and software designer and researcher, and he is the author of the fantastic new book, Building SimCity: How to Put the World in a Machine. As is probably clear from the title, this new book is about the creation of SimCity. But it's also about much more than that. It's about the deep prehistory and ideas that went into the game, from system dynamics to cellular automata, as well as a broader history of Maxis, the company behind SimCity. Chaim previously worked with Will Wright, who created SimCity, on the game Spore, and Chaim designed the Spore Creature Creator. Because of this, Chaim's deep knowledge of Maxis, his access to the folks there, and his excitement about SimCity and everything around it makes him the perfect person to have written this book. SimCity was one of the few computer games I really got into. I played the original and SimCity 2000, but it also opened my mind to ideas around simulation and urban design. I love SimCity, so getting to geek out about it with Chaim was a true pleasure. Let's dive in. Your book is awesome. This book, Building SimCity: How to Put the World in a Machine. A lot of fun. Oh, there it is. Yeah. For those who cannot see it, because this is audio, Chaim has just lifted it up and showed it to us. I have my own copy right here as well.
You got it.
Yeah, I did get it. And so, for me, I grew up with SimCity. I think my first taste of it was actually like the black and white Macintosh version, like the original SimCity, and then went to SimCity 2000, which in my mind, I think was kind of like the true embodiment of SimCity. Like it was like, okay, it's like there were a lot of cool ideas in the original one, kind of top down, but then once you have like the isometric, it was just great. And for you, it's not just intellectually interesting. Like there's a lot, and we'll get into all that, but like there's also like a personal connection, SimCity, or at least Maxis, because you actually work there. And I'd love to just at least begin a little bit. Like you can kind of tell how you ended up there and what you did and kind of like that whole experience.
Yeah, so that's kind of a wild story. So like you, I also grew up playing SimCity on a black and white on a Mac SE, which I'm sure I pirated from a neighbor kid. You know, we got it probably around 1989, 90, and then later played SimCity 2000, which I think still is the kind of, gold standard, and grew up playing these games and many other games. Let's see, I was doing a master's degree at Georgia Tech in the time the program was called Information Design and Technology, and my advisor was Janet Murray, who wrote Hammond on the Holodeck, and I had a lot of awesome professors there. And part of that program was an internship required between years 1 and year 2. And at one point, I got this email from Janet, and it said something like, she was like, "Where are you going to do your internship?" And I was like, "I don't know. Like, I like to work in games, but I also kind of don't really want to work in games because I love games, but I also don't really like games, and I have a complicated relationship with games."
And so did you grow up? Other than SimCity, like had you grown up playing kind of more traditional games, or was it always like those kinds of games that you played, kind of like the weird like sandbox kind of simulation toy kind of games?
I think I grew up playing these. I was really into mazes as a kid, and then I grew up playing like these arcade games. I was born in '80, so I grew up went to the arcade and played I was exposed to like Pac-Man and all kinds of stuff, right, from that era. And then the first at some point we bought the neighbor's Atari 2600 and played that stuff, and was exposed to Mario and we had a Nintendo and Super Nintendo, which at some point my parents kind of gave in and let us have those things. But also my dad was a math professor, still is, and he was bringing home like the Mac SE, which I think he took from a grad student who was playing too many games or something like that. He was very
like as like a punishment kind of thing, like make sure he actually finishes his dissertation.
Yeah, it's like very much my dad. Yeah, exactly. It's like, I'm taking back your Mac. I'm gonna give it to my kids so they can play games.
That's amazing.
Then he brought home this Apollo workstation, which is like this like very, very, it was like he had this NASA grant, I think, and he had this very very high-end Unix workstation. They don't make them anymore. It was kind of like I remember it had like 1,000 floppy disks. You had to it was like hours to install the OS on it. And so we're also exposed to these like this kind of the world of these like Unix games, like obviously Snake, but there was just, I think, a Hunt the Wumpus. There's all these games that didn't really make sense to us. We went to the computer labs at the university, and so we also got a taste of, I think, this sort of older computer game culture as well.
Mm-hmm.
So we kind of were like exposed to these multiple game cultures in a sense. There's this very popular game culture and Nintendo arcade games, and then this sort of more this older academic culture that came, it has sort of in a sense deeper roots in the history of computing, you could argue. So the Maxis games were kind of like heady. I don't know, they were just like fun, but they were clearly different. But there was also, as you and I both know, there was the world of early 90s Mac gaming, as Richard Moss has written about. It was
Yeah,
like
yeah.
kind of like a wild, wild place, very diverse
Yes, it was
place.
very different. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I grew up playing Glider and like those kinds of games, which are,
Yeah,
I mean, I think if you were around, yeah, for like that 90s period in Mac, yeah, it's a big name, but if you take like one step outside of the Mac world, no one's ever heard of this game. It's
right.
like super
And then
weird. Yeah.
and then in the late '80s, all those hypercars, all this weird stuff. Like I remember there was one game. It was like it was this really beautiful bitmap of a camel. Maybe you remember this. And there was a needle, and the game was like get the camel through the needle. And it may have just been and like it may have just been a joke, like, but it may have been a game with a puzzle, the solution. I don't know, you know. Yeah,
Okay, so you were playing a lot. So you were interested in like all these different kind of aspects, like all these different game cultures. But
yeah.
it sounds like you had like two minds about the gaming world in terms of like getting involved in it. Is that
Yeah. Oh, and also we were playing at school, at public school. We had like Apple IIs
okay?
in West Virginia. So like, also I should just say that like, so we also saw that stuff. So we did play the Broderbund stuff,
Like
and we
Carmen
were
San
and I
Diego,
learned
or yeah, or I
yeah,
guess
and I learned
Oregon Trail, which was a different company, but yeah, yeah,
exactly Oregon Trail. Yeah, and then we did play, and I was I think in third grade I learned to program in BASIC at like summer camp, and that kind of blew. I mean, it was like the first program was like 10 print Chaim 20 go to 10, and it was just like
yes,
right.
just like
It's
yeah,
like the
a
first.
stream of your name.
Yeah, exactly. It's like this is the best ever, right? So and then so I was also trying. I think from that point on, I was trying to build games too. So it was like,
Okay,
and as maybe we'll talk about later. I actually think that the medium of computer games is about building games. So
interesting.
that's one of my theses from coming out doing this work.
Well, so well, actually, before we go into more of your personal history, yeah, tell me more about that. Like, yeah, so like is it that the people who actually build computer games don't necessarily like playing the games as much, and so it's almost like using kind of new techniques and new technologies to kind of figure out ways of creating these like, open worlds or kind of worlds to explore, and so like that's kind of the like the actual endeavor of computer games is less about the playing and more about the creation using kind of these new technologies. Is that kind of what you're thinking?
Well, I think that it's like I just think about the dominant. I think about like there's the whole Maxis tradition of these very creative sandboxy games, and I think that Minecraft, Roblox, these very dominant game genres nowadays that are about making stuff. I think that is really, I think making stuff, maybe like making games is kind of what games are about. In many ways, they look like little kids, what they do when they play, and it's like, we just make the games. Like the game is this play as a sort of ossified thing with fixed rules is kind of a specific form of play. This is one of my, things that I came across doing play research. And I just it's kind of like just looking at the whole long history of computer games. It's this pattern I saw over and over again, where it's like people like Wozniak built the Apple II so that he could play basic games. That was his main motivation. And then he made basic. He knew that he needed basic to make the games. That's where the games are all written in basic. And then so the Apple II comes out of the box with the ability to like make your own software. And that's what gets Bill Budge, who makes Pinball Construction Set, going. People start modifying his game. So there's something about the pleasure of making games as like a key part of the fun. And I
Yeah, and
just
you see
think
this
that
even with like Doom, like there are all these mods, or I mean, going back to like Glider and Glider Pro, like there was like a game, like a level editor or house editor or whatever it was. Yeah, like there was
totally,
always this like kind of interplay between playing the game and then figuring out a way to kind of make a game that you can allow
yes,
others to play with as well.
exactly. Yes, exactly. Doom is super important in the history of this sort of modding. And I think that sort of the games that have an outsized impact tend to be ones about, they encourage this modding and openness.
No, it's
Yeah.
fascinating.
And also you look at so many of the dominant game genres, so many dominant games now came out of mods of older games. So there's this kind of, you look at the ecology of games. Like there was a game that was really popular, like World of Warcraft mod. And they were like, people still want to play this game. It's hard to play because you have to go buy this old game that that doesn't really get sold anymore. And you have to install this mod. Let's just make this game, make it free to play. And it was like, just kind of like a genius big game business idea. Right. So there's just like, and there's this whole, like in Gary's mod, you look at the Wikipedia, it's like one of those best-selling games of all time. It's a mod in Half-Life. So it's
Right.
like, all about, it's like in a sense, games need about creating the tools to like make your own play, make your own games.
Okay, so let's jump back. Okay, so you were doing your master's and you had to get an internship, and you were trying to like figure
Yes.
out where to do that or kind of how to do
Yeah.
it.
Yes, exactly. Have I told you this story? I forget.
I mean, you mentioned it a little bit in the beginning of the book, but I don't actually know the detail.
Oh, this is a really funny story. So yeah, it's funny in many different ways. Some of them are embarrassing. So Janet Murray says, you got to do internship. We thought about what you're going to do. And I was like, I don't really know, and I was like, kind of would like to work in games, but I don't know. And then I get this email from sitting in the computer lab one day, and I get this email from her, and she says, "Oh, I just got this email from a Maxis recruiter. Are you interested in working with Will Wright?" And Janet and Will knew each other, which we could talk about why that is later on. And I was like, yeah. And then like an hour later, I get an email.
Of course I am.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, of course. So it's like it's like hero. So it's like getting to work for Willy Wonka and to make candy, right? And I was like, yeah. So an hour later, I get an email back from Janet, and it's like, okay, you've got to, you just need to. I forget. I can probably find the email on my computer right now, but it's like, you've got the internship. So basically, I think in that time, Janet had written like a 1-paragraph recommendation to the recruiter, which went to Will, which then came back, and it was like, I think that. But then he asked me an interview question over email. I forget when exactly this happened, but there was like me and another intern had gotten like spots like with him, and one of us was going to work on The Sims Online, and one of us was going to work on Spore. And I was like, at the time I was like Sim Everything, and I was like, I want to work on the Powers of 10 game, of course.
Yeah.
And he asked me this interview question. But basically, I think I was like, even the interview question I thought was brilliant. It was like an email homework question. It was like, if you had to represent any civilization in the universe with only 10 parameters, what would the 10 parameters be?
That's amazing.
Yeah. And so it just even, of course, the framing of the question itself just shows his brilliance, where he's trying to, it's like, how do you take this like kind of impossible subject, something which is impossible to get your head around, and compress it down to just 10 dimensions?
Do you
10
remember what your
parameters.
answer was?
Yeah, I have the emails here. Oh, here we go. Spore Project. Here's an exercise for you to think about. If you had to define all possible intelligent cultures, historic and future, biologic to mechanical, with less than 10 parameters, what would they be? These parameters should be high enough to apply to any conceivable culture, yet low enough to derive tangible assets, art, technology, cities, behaviors. A couple of candidates to come up with are introverted, extroverted. How much is the culture's attention focused on itself versus understanding the outside world? And how static or expansionistic is it? I'd be interested to hear your list of parameters. Then I write it back like a week later with my list of 10, which is like, anyhow.
What are they?
What did I write? After much brainstorming and scribbling, inward, outward looking, which is what he described, temperature, amount of pressure on a culture, volatility, time perception, very short term like animals, very long term like religion, big enough to consider long term consequences, modest enough to plan substantial projects. That sounds good. How does the individual relate to the group? What is the locus of importance? Self, family, community, what scale? I like that still. Okay. Homogeneity, degree of political stratification and cultural specialization, subjunctivity, creativity, mean mutation rate, cultural identity, culture's self-perception of its unique sameness in the topology of cultures might relate to what icons stand for the culture. Importance, role of value system, violence. Is empathy the opposite? Question mark. Knowledge, material wealth. And then I write a bunch of stuff.
And so this is what got you the internship with Spore.
This is before. This preceded it.
Right.
So I guess at this point,
I'm saying like this, like answering it this way was what was necessary to kind of get you to work with Spore as was The Sims.
I think it helped. I think it was like,
that's awesome.
Yeah. I mean, it was like, it was, I forget exactly how it played out. I have to,
Okay. And so when you were there, so this is Spore. I mean, Spore came out in 2008 or 2009. Is that, I can't remember.
2000.
Does that sound correct?
8, I think.
Okay, 2008. Yeah, it was like the fall of 2008, I believe.
Yeah.
Okay, so this was still, so Spore was still very much in its infancy.
That's right.
At the time. Okay, and then you were, so was this kind of like an apprenticeship with like Will Wright's brain at that point? Just to kind of like see how he thought and kind of, were you kind of working on
what were they doing?
Yeah. What was kind of going on at the time? And then, because then you also, and after your master's, you ended up coming back. And
That's
then
right. I graduated. They really wanted me to stay and not finish my master's degree. But at the time I was like, well, I was like, maybe I want to be an academic. I mean, much later I went to do a PhD, as you know, but at the time I wasn't sure, but I really wanted to finish the master's degree. So I went and did that. But at the time it was like, so Maxis was in Walnut Creek, and they had this, it was like this, they were on I think they had 2 floors of this modern building, and there was The Sims was on one floor, I think. And another floor was The Sims Online, maybe. I don't know. There was like The Sims and Sims Online. So they were starting to work on The Sims 2. There was like Sims expansion pack team, and The Sims Online was the big effort. So Electronic Arts, if you look at the SEC filings, Electronic Arts, one of the reasons they bought Maxis was they wanted to, it was 1997, online games.
Okay.
That was like, it was like the internet, right? Network. They were online games. So they saw Maxis, this PC game maker, as a potential maker of online stuff. So The Sims Online at the time, I think, was it Ultima Online was the dominant online? It was like these online games can make a ton of money. There's clearly big money
Right.
there.
There was a sense of, so something
Yeah,
was
it's
going
like you
on.
could subscription, you buy the box product and then you pay like a fee every month, right? It was just
Yeah.
like, but at the time also, this is before, nowadays it's very easy, relatively easy to build and deploy these kinds of online network systems. But at the time they were heroic engineering undertakings. So it was like this enormous team, and the design is what they're struggling with the design. So there's this massive team under tremendous pressure from EA to deliver The Sims Online, and Will was involved with it, and they did a lot of cool stuff. And so it was like that was the big thing. But so I think Spore at that time was Will's sort of this fun little thing he did on the side. It was sort of hiding, because I think at one point he said something like, it was like, we're hiding in the shadow of this bigger creature. And at one point when the Sims team was moved to Redwood City and our Spore stayed, he was like, yeah, we're about to get a lot more attention. It's like this big creature is kind of walking away, and we're gonna, like, we were in its shadow and now we're gonna be exposed, right? So at the
Interesting.
time, let's see, there was a few people working on Spore. I was the only full-time person working on it that summer, which is part of what was fun for both of us. So there was Ocean Quigley, who was the art director for Spore, had done some
Okay.
work on it, and then Ocean, who had then been pulled away everyone had been pulled away to do other stuff.
Okay.
It was more high priority. And then Jason Schenkel, this brilliant engineer I got to work with again recently, he had been working, he had already built this whole Powers of 10, like zoomable prototype playable game for
Oh,
Spore already at that
that's
point. So he
amazing.
had been working on the project already for, I think, for at least a year, and maybe probably more. I'm being conservative here. And then he had this other engineer. He had these very senior engineers, Kees van Prohen. I'm definitely saying his name wrong. This kind of Dutch kind of computational artist guy. And they say how they'd done some stuff and they've been pulled away. So I was sort of in the hallway outside of Will's office and the executive team for the Sims Online TSO. And there was like, and Will had this Elvis shrine. It was like, Will is wonderful, eccentric, creative man. He had this whole Elvis shrine. He's from the South. The velvet Elvis and everything is kind of like a joke, right? And so I was there next to the Elvis shrine, and the other intern was there, who taught me some great simulation techniques. And I was just making cool prototypes for Spore. So that summer, I was like 3 months. I did 3 different prototypes, and we were like we were reading Christopher Alexander's new book, which I don't think had been published yet, but he had a copy of it. And, we were like, I remember building one agent simulation that tried to do like a pattern language kind of stuff that was relevant to Spore. I mean, just really out this cellular automata models of like bacteria and solar system and galaxies, civilizations spreading through galaxies. What was the other prototype? Was this, there's this artificial life kind of thing, this like physics simulation-y, like kind of like soda constructor kind of like thing where you could,
Soda
and then you
constructor.
could write these custom rule sets and could parse these rules and make new. Yeah,
That's
it was a
amazing.
lot of fun.
Well, and that kind of like magpie-like approach to like, okay, like let's take all these ideas from all these different domains of like architecture and biology and mathematics or whatever, and like that, and going back to like SimCity, there's a huge amount of like prehistory and kind of like intellectual foundation for SimCity as well. And I feel like if you're kind of familiar with like the SimCity origin story, like there's kind of like the capsule version of like Will Wright was working on this other game, and he kind of liked building like the level editor kind of more and kind of building these little cities. And so it was like, oh, let's actually turn this into a real game. But in addition to that, there's all these other things around like systems dynamics and cellular automata and like other aspects of simulation, like all these different things. And maybe you can kind of just like give like a, I don't know, like a 10,000-foot view of like some of the, like, because it's a huge amount of like number of influences, and you mentioned like the like pinball construction set and some of these kind of like games that kind of allow you to build games, and like what is your, and this is actually like a decent fraction of your book is really about sort of this prehistory, like this like intellectual history. Yeah, like tell me a little bit about that, all those things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big part of what made, if you think back to us, being kids playing, encountering SimCity versus encountering Mario and all this other stuff, Glider, is that I think part of what made SimCity so unique is the synthesis of all these different ideas that went into it. I think you could sort of, when you played that game, it immediately felt like nothing else that
Well,
was
there was a
out
lot
there.
like under the hood. Like you could tell. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
and you go in your book, you actually go into, okay, what was actually under the hood and kind of how it was
yeah,
done. And some of that's like a little bit smoke and mirrors, but clearly there was a decent amount of sophistication under the hood. Like it
yeah,
wasn't just this kind of like fun little world that you're kind of walking around and you're kind of
totally.
like laying tiles on. It's like you lay tiles down and then it's up to the simulation to decide, okay, what actually kind of happens to these
Yes.
like things that have been
Yeah.
zoned for commercial or residential or whatever it is.
Yeah. There's a huge amount of, yeah. So some of the influences. So like you said, there's the system dynamics line of work, which is this is a simulation technique developed by Jay Forrester, who is a pioneer of digital computing. In the 1950s, he developed the first interactive graphical computer. And then he was like, I think we've kind of solved all the hard problems with computers. So he's like, I'm going to try to move on to something else. And in a sense, he was kind of right, because it's like, but in a sense, it's kind of a really funny comment in retrospect. So he then went on to do all this simulation. He went to the business school at MIT from engineering and developed this whole technique for modeling businesses as these dynamic systems. And then went on to model cities and then the world and economies. And so there's this whole influence Will took from that work, and he integrated that Jay Forrester's urban dynamics work with
Did he interact
influx.
with Jay Forrester directly, or was it much more just like he kind of read some of the books and
No,
kind of saw?
he read. I mean, Will's a huge reader. He's one of the most sort of intellectually omnivorous people I know. Yeah, so he was reading that stuff. Though Will did have a neighbor who was a city planner named Bruce Jaffe, who I talked to a while back. Bruce had actually taken a course from Forrester at
Okay,
MIT on system dynamics, but they both say that that's not how Will found out about Forrester's work. But
interesting. I mean, and the weird thing is that like many years down the line, a lot of people who are involved in like city design and kind of like urban dynamics, like they were influenced by playing SimCity as kids,
exactly.
and so it's like a very kind of interesting circle there.
Totally. Yeah, totally. And then of course there's the pinball construction set sort of thread. I use that as a shorthand, but pinball construction set is the first time that the GUI, the graphical user interface, the conventions that crystallized the Xerox PARC in the 1970s, that's the first time the pinball construction, even though the Macintosh is the sort of the well-known computer example, like pinball construction set is actually the first time that those things sort of reach a broad audience in the form of a computer game, which is, I think, a delicious story. And Bill Budge, who worked on that, had worked at Apple as an engineer and been exposed to those ideas. He worked on, I think, did he work on the Apple III or the Lisa, maybe both of them?
I
So
don't
he
know.
kind of absorbed into Apple's enthusiasm for the GUI and then used that in his pinball construction set game. And that's the thing that Will saw that got him turned on to it. Because I think Bill came from a more, he had done I don't know if he finished it, but I think he'd worked on a PhD at Cal one point. So he had this more academic exposure. He's like, yeah, he said at one point, I knew about the stuff at Xerox PARC. I'd heard about it, but I didn't understand why it was so cool until I actually was at Apple and got exposed to it more directly.
Interesting.
So I don't
And
think that Will.
sorry, you continue.
So I don't think that Will. I don't know that because he's kind of like a more of the like scruffy outsider in a sense. Like it's sort of in terms of the computing cultures, he's not close to the kind of elite academic sphere. So I think that he probably needed that exposure through pinball construction set to get turned on to those ideas.
Interesting. And the actual user interface for like the original SimCity, and I guess like SimCity 2000 as well, it takes a lot of inspiration from like the Mac Paint kind of like
Yeah,
Photoshop style. Kind of
totally.
like, okay, here's like different tools, and you kind of use them to kind of like paint the environment or whatever as well.
Absolutely. But what's interesting is that the first version of the SimCity was originally written for the Commodore 64. And he says at the time I wanted to make a GUI, and he made a thing with icons and and so on, but like it's really clunky and it doesn't quite But he says like it was a very imperfect. It was a lot of great execution of the GUI ideas, but once it got onto the Mac, and Will had this bigger team that there was like a dedicated Mac engineer, at least more than one. Then it can the ideas there, the approach can sort of blossom and sort of really take on the affordances of the Mac, right? And use them, the toolbox, that Apple offered, and sort of come into its own, right? And
That's
they had
great. Yeah,
Mac
yeah.
Paint at that point to look at.
Right. And so related to like the actual development of SimCity. I mean, so and you mentioned like there were like Mac engineers kind of involved and things like that. Were the other people early on in the development of SimCity also reading really widely and kind of trying to take ideas from all these different domains, or was it very much like Will Wright was like it was his vision, kind of like his vision was kind of combining all these things together in his head, and then everyone else around him was sort of executing. Because I know you sound like later, by the time you were doing Spore stuff, like there was kind of this, I don't know, like at least it was more distributed, where there were lots of people kind
Yeah.
of thinking about these kinds of things. But early on, was it really just him, or were there other people doing these kinds of things as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that for the sort of core vision of if you look at the SimCity code, the original SimCity code, like it's clearly like Will owns the simulation code. So
Mhm.
it's like
Okay.
the kind of the sort of like the core kind of like that model is like his model. And he's the one who's, I think, pulling from all these different influences. However, I don't think you would have SimCity. I don't think you'd have a successful SimCity without the other people that worked on it. So, for instance, Jeff Braun, Will's business partner, who co-founded Maxis, he's very modest. When you talk to him, he says, he's like, I don't have any idea. And there's no idea of mine that's in SimCity. And I think he's appropriately humble. However, I think that as a business guy who wants to sell a product to a mass market, and it's not, I think that Will's inclination is probably more, I'm going to make this really cool. I have this genius idea and I'm going to follow my inclinations regardless of whether or not other people want it and make this cool thing for me. Though he is very savvy about thinking about other people and what they want. Like, I think like Will had shelved SimCity. It wasn't called SimCity yet because Bruderbund, the publisher of Random Bungling Bay, didn't want it. They were like, this is too weird.
Yeah.
And so you needed, I think Jeff was critical to sort of see that and say, there's something here, to look at the Commodore 64 prototype, now the prototype, right? And to say, there's something here, we can make this into a mass market product. And Jeff is the one who then built that bigger team around Will and was like, no, I believe in this. I'm going to spend my money on this. I'm going to bring it to market. I'm going to help this reach a wider audience. And then they brought on I think there was a Rob Stroh. There was these Mac developers they brought on to help build out that part. And having worked with Will, he's very smart about interaction design, but that kind of the sort of interface design is not his. That's not his. It's always other people that kind of come in and sort of complement him and do that. So I think that he had the kind of overarching idea, and then because that kind of more refined version that hits the Macintosh is definitely the result of a collaboration with other people. But the core
Okay.
sort of synthesis is his.
Okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, so you mentioned it's like Jeff Braun saw something in,
Yes.
I guess, what eventually became SimCity, which was kind of at the time called something else, and then was like, okay, we're going to build Maxis as this kind of like either a studio and publisher. I guess it was like a studio publisher hybrid. Is that kind of the way to think about it?
Yeah.
And which I guess is also kind of related to like the history of gaming as well. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
But
So are you asking about the Maxis?
yeah, I'm just interested in like, yeah. And so he kind of created this thing, and like Max, I mean, Maxis had an unbelievable hit with SimCity. And then they're like, okay, let's try to almost turn this one of a kind thing into like a genre of game or simulation toy or whatever it was. And like, it was like Maxis was like a very different type of game company from all the other game companies that were around at the time. Like, at least that's my sense.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're probably right. And at the same time, I also think like I just think about, there was all this weird diversity at the time that we kind of don't really remember also. I'm sure if you flip through if you I'll go on the Internet Archive and flip through all the old like Mac Worlds and, other game magazines, there's all kinds of weird stuff too. But yeah, Maxis was strange. I think that's fair to say. They were unusual. I mean, Jeff originally wanted to build a game publisher. That was his vision. That was his business idea. And they released Sky Chase first, which was like this dogfighting
Okay.
game, and just something that I didn't know about. And like when I first talked to Jeff, he was like, "I don't know about this. Like, let me tell you about Sky Chase." So Sky Chase, it was not there's a reason why no one knows about it, but not that they say it was, it just wasn't SimCity. But he also knew that. So he says I knew SimCity was going to be the hit, and Sky Chase was the first game they released in this publisher distributor partnership with Britterbund, where he's like, he said that analogy he used at one point is, he's the first pancake is always comes out burned. So he's like, we need to like do one first, to kind of get practice with the whole thing, and then we'll do SimCity. He's like, that was going to be the big one. And so I think that early on they had a wider portfolio, and then SimCity was the one that really hit. And I think that over time it became clear that Maxis, that was like where they needed to be and stay. I don't know that was obvious to Jeff from the beginning. I think he knew SimCity he thought SimCity was going to be big, but I think he had a broader ambition. And at some point it was like,
So, and related to that, I mean, and you mentioned that like maybe we've kind of like forgotten how weird the gaming industry, or in truth, like the software industry was like several decades ago. maybe like the right analogy is kind of this, like there was a Cambrian explosion, then there were a whole bunch of extinction events, and like now there's only kind of the things that have survived. Is it one of these things where that there's a path, like there's a certain amount of like path dependence where, okay, these certain companies have survived because of random chance versus like because these are the only kinds of things that actually can survive? And so I guess my question becomes, Maxis was weird among other types of companies that were also kind of weird in their own way. Was it, is it almost like predetermined that Maxis was not going to survive because it was one of these kinds of like weird like species or types of organisms that were just kind of different than like the kinds of successful gaming companies that you could create? Or I mean, it also sounds like there were a number of like other reasons that they kind of ended up not being as
Yeah, I mean,
successful as
just
they could
sort
have
of.
been.
I mean, yeah, I mean, this is like a counterfactual. You're like, I'm kind of wondering, like, well, if we play out these alternate history, are these other alternate histories of Maxis that would have gone very different, where like Sim Earth would have been a huge hit, and then like Sim Earth and Sim Ant and Sim Life, the kind of like the ones, this kind of like canonical. I think those are the canonical like weird
Like
Sim
they were like
Maxis
super weird.
titles.
Yeah, yeah.
They
Like
were super weird.
it's
And
like
kind of,
yeah, like yeah, more simulation, less so toy. I guess toy, but like yeah, like there's not much of a game. Yeah, it's like they're very kind of very distinctively Maxis.
I think those are the ones that sort of like, yeah. And so, because those are the ones that those kept coming out, and they were like, at that point, Maxis, we can get into this or not here, but like, they took on venture capital funding in 1992, and that was a big influence on them to kind of be more risk averse, and and also the venture VCs had their own idea for what Maxis should become, and so there's kind of like Maxis really straddled these different worlds I talk about in the book between like science and popular culture. It's like Will Wright is hanging out with Nintendo, with Shigeru Miyamoto, who made Mario in 19, and basically around the same time, he's hanging out at the Santa Fe Institute with Arthur Brooks, one of the champions of cellular automata, one of the inventors of ENIAC, and blanking on his name, but Nicholas, one of the creators of the Monte Carlo technique, right? He's like,
Nicholas Metropolis.
yes, Metropolis. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So he's like in workshops with these. So he's like going between, like he's like with Mario and Monte Carlo, right? Like all at the same time. So he's really in these different worlds. And then and Chevron is hiring Maxis to do these business simulations, like some refineries. So, and that's part of what gets the VCs excited, because they see that, oh, there's an enterprise simulation company here. Right. So they can make these accessible things. So it's so, they're straddling these different worlds, and those early sim titles that we like, Sim Life, Sim Earth, they kind of promise more of that SimCity magic of being able to kind of do it all at once and kind of hit all those audiences at the same time. But it doesn't, they can't, they're not able to reproduce it for we can speculate, like there's many reasons that could be, at least not at the scale that they want to grow at the right amount. So that puts pressure on them. A lot of things, I mean, there's a lot of things that are dysfunctional. I mean,
it's interesting.
It's fascinating.
So you mentioned, yeah, so like Will Wright is kind of, he's like straddling all these different worlds. I guess Maxis as a whole is straddling these worlds. He's talking to like the titans of the gaming world, talking to people who are thinking about complexity science. And so there is kind of this very interesting, and we kind of mentioned before, but like this virtuous circle where, like, on the one hand, Will Wright is influenced by a lot of these ideas. But in turn, a lot of the people from the complexity science world or kind of computational and quantitative social sciences are also, or in biology, like they're also being influenced by these things as well.
Yes.
And was this like, and I imagine this was not Will Wright's like goal in kind of building this kind of thing. Like he just wanted to build it, but like, and was he like super excited to kind of be part of this like science popularization or kind of public intellectual kind of thing? Like what was kind of and did he want to spend more time in that kind of world in a way that he thought would actually like strengthen Maxis? Was this kind of one of his explicit things?
I think that's, yeah, I think I think he really was. I think that this was not obvious to me. I think I asked him at one point I was writing the book, researching the book. I asked him about how he saw himself after SimCity was released, right? Because it's like, how there's kind of like how, I mean, of course, also doing this kind of historical research, it's like also people don't necessarily remember. It's kind of like also there's like the historiography. It's like there's the stories people tell themselves in each other, different moments in time, and the stories we could go back and tell, right? And how, so it gets complicated. However, he did say, so I did ask him, I said, how did you see yourself there? Because there's clearly this point where he's like, I'm going to do Sim Earth next. And he said he saw himself as a science popularizer very explicitly. And he said that he really looked up to Carl Sagan, which I think is very telling, because Carl Sagan is, of course, like one of the preeminent science popularizers of the 20th century. So I think he saw himself in that vein. And so it kind of made sense for him to go to Sim Earth next, in a sense.
And it was also, like, to a certain degree, like, it was very much of that time. Like, there were a lot of ideas kind of swirling around, like late 80s, early 90s, like, that were kind of straddling the sort of like
Yes.
the sciences and popularization, like whether it was like the ideas of Carl Sagan, the ideas of fractals, like there were a lot of these kinds of things that were deeply interdisciplinary and scientific, but also very appealing to popular culture. Like, is it one of these, and going back to kind of all these counterfactuals and alternate histories, like,
Yeah.
is it like Maxis is very like, is there a sense that Maxis was very much a like a child of this time? Like, it was almost like it could only occur during this kind of moment because of all these. I mean, obviously it's not overdetermined. Like, Will Wright had to kind of come up with these kinds of things, but like, would it be? And I love this idea of like straddling all these different kinds of worlds, and like from like the gaming world and the sciences and stuff like that. But like, and I wonder, like, could this kind of thing just keep on happening? Like, could it happen in like the early 2000s? Could it happen today? Or is it the kind of thing where it was very much of that time?
I mean, I think it was very much of that time. I don't think that it means that you couldn't do it again.
That's fair. Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's, you're driving it to. And actually, there is a counterfactual. Here's a useful counterfactual. Actually, here's one of the techniques that I use in the book, which I picked up from John Peterson's playing incredible history of D&D, playing at the world. This is like this epic piece of game history that I highly recommend. That I think MIT Press is soon reissuing updated edition.
Really, they are. That's cool.
In the same series is my book. He does this thing where he'll like look at he'll do this comparative. He'll like, well, let's look at what else was happening at the same time. So like, what are the other sort of lines of exploration? So around the same time, so you look at Scientific American. Scientific American is like this place where cellular automata, fractals, computer simulation is like coming, all these scientific ideas are in a sense filtering into a mainstream audience. And there you see advertisements. I just stumbled, while I was doing my research, I stumbled across these advertisements for like, so Rudy Rucker, who's a famous science fiction author and mathematician, he shows up in our story. He released, so James Blake's Chaos is released in 1987, I think. So
that sounds right. Yeah.
Sounds right. Yeah. So that comes out. And then so Rudy Rucker he collaborates with John Walker, I think this founder, CEO of Autodesk. And they make this CA lab. I think it's called CA lab. It's one of the, I forget, I might get the name wrong, but
I believe it's
they make a product, like a cellular automata product, and you see the market. You see them advertising it. I think they're advertising it. It's reviewed in the Whole Earth Review. It's
amazing.
I think it's advertised in Scientific American, and then he goes on to make with James Blake a Chaos program. So he's like, and he's writing about it, and he's very excited about being able to take these scientific ideas to a mass audience. So and it's like, and the advertisement is hilarious. It's like, find your favorite part of the Mandelbrot set. Like it's very like they're really like pitch it. It's like, turn the fractals into music. It's like so they're trying. So they're hustling on. It's like so to me this is like a cousin of Maxis, right? It's like here's someone else trying another kind of science popularization idea in a sense, but it doesn't hit. And I think that there's many reasons we can speculate why, but Maxis, I think one of the reasons is that Maxis, like, there's this goofiness to SimCity. Like, there's Godzilla, right? Or not Godzilla, apparally, but there's this giant monster who destroys your city. There's like, it's like,
right, it's got generic reptilian monster.
Yeah, exactly. There's like the sense of humor that's very, very Will Wright, right? It's like, and so it's like this silliness, and there's this, and it's got this very video gaminess as well about it too, right? It's not dry, right? There's like, things explode, things move quickly. So there's this whole video game influence in there as well. So I think that part of it is the kind of Will's design sensibility. And part of it is, I think, also a kind of market machinery where, because Maxis titles could pass as games, they could be sold through the distribution channels, like through Bruderbund, into the same outlets that would sell other titles. So there was this kind of established, they were sort of piggybacking on this established mechanisms for moving products to market, for advertising and moving products to market.
So it was like legible enough to kind of like fit into these like pre-existing, like you could like slot it into these pre-existing categories, but it was able to kind of bring together all these things in a way, or it was able to bring things together in the way that like CA Lab did or whatever. But CA Lab was just too hard to categorize, and as a result, probably didn't,
and maybe
it was like, or it was too serious, maybe. Or it sounds like,
not as sticky,
it was silly and fun,
and like it's got this compulsive playability that's like comes from system dynamics, and so it's like this sort of that instability. It's like you're trying to get your this thing to stay upright. And like this thing, the game just keeps pushing and pulling at you. It's like it's got more of the fun of a game, right? Even though it's about a city, right? So it doesn't make it. It's like a very
Yeah,
contradictory
yeah.
package.
Right. Yeah. You describe it to someone on or on paper or whatever, and you're like, yeah, this doesn't make any sense. It's like a thing that people are going to want to play, and I remember like when I was little, I think my brother and I would have cities, and like we would like have them going and like and we would like wait for a while to try to get enough money for an airport or whatever it was, and like you just wanted to keep on playing and like
Yeah.
exploring it. Are there any like, do you see, I mean, obviously there are kind of more modern city simulation titles and city games kinds of things right now. Do you feel like, have you come across anything that kind of like fits kind of the more like it would be like a modern version of something from Maxis like nowadays? Are there any specific like games or kind of game like things that you would point to as like, okay, like this feels like something like from that time period as well?
It's a good question. I'm sure there's stuff out there. I have to admit that I'm not, again, this comes back to my love-hate relationship with games. I'm not like a super big game player, and I have two young kids right now, as you may be able to see evidence of behind me. So I don't really have any time to play games.
That's fine.
I mean, yeah. I mean, I just remember at one point, Jeff Braun told me, he's like, it was the first, he was very generous. We did a lot of interviews together. He said something like, you didn't ask me what games I wish Maxis had made. And I was like, okay, well, I was like, hey, well, what do you know? And he's like, Roblox. And it is, at the time, I was like, I was very dismissive. I was like, okay, yeah, sure. Of course you want the biggest at the time. This was, I think, 2015 or 2016. So of course you want the biggest, of course you wish you made the biggest game ever. But then I was thinking about it later, doing more research, I was like, oh yeah, no, actually, like this is sort of in the line of Max's title. This is it's like that kind of open sandbox play that is very Maxis-y. And I do think that you wouldn't have Minecraft. I think it's hard to imagine things like Minecraft, Roblox, this current craze for cozy builder games. There's this whole genre now about these like fun builder games. These are very kind of relaxing building games. I think that Maxis is an important stepping stone to there. But in terms of straddling these different worlds, I don't know. I think it's a hard thing to pull off.
No, I agree, but I think though that, I mean, right, like whether it's Maxis or these other companies, where there's this, like, in addition to kind of like the system dynamics and the cellular automata, all these kind of science ideas, there's also just like these two fundamental things, which is this idea of like people love, and especially children like love this idea of open-ended play. Like that, okay, you have a framework and you can kind of explore and do things and kind of build the kind of games that like build your own sort of games, or kind of play in a way that you want, where you can set your own goals and things like that. And then there's that, and then there's also the idea that like, right, computers are not just for like computation and arithmetic, but they're also there's like this very human aspect to them, which you mentioned kind of like with like the graphical user interface and like creating these like things that bring computing down to kind of the human scale. And I feel like Maxis was able to really blend those two things very well, in a way that, yeah, maybe some modern things are doing it as well, but hopefully we can see more of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, to me, this is like one of the kind of deepest points, one of the most deepest and interesting parts about computing, which is that it's like there's this kind of intrinsic ambiguity to Maxis, right? Like these different communities are parsing it in different ways. And in fact, they're sort of buttressing each other's interpretations. Like the urban, this like city planners, like, this is so exciting, it's city planning. And the complexity scientists are saying it's bringing complexity science to the masses. And then the game review magazines are saying, oh, it's so realistic because look at this, what these other guys are doing, they're saying. And then the people that are teaching are like, we can teach with this because it's fun and it's easy to use. And Nintendo's like, wants it because it's like really fun. They're also trying to expand the audience for video games. But I think there's this intrinsic, and this is a point that the historian Michael Mahoney makes about computers, is that computers are fundamentally, like at their core, they're very plastic. They're kind of, they're ambiguous. It's like they can be anything. Because they look at like what Turing's ideas about the universal machine, Turing machine. It's like a computer, you reprogram it and it becomes something else. So the idea of this kind of flexible protean machine that can become, in a sense, whatever you want it to become, that idea is sort of baked into the like what computers are. So I think that, and so we kind of make of them what we want. So in a sense, like SimCity, in some really deep sense, is sort of manifesting the inherent plasticity of computing. So it's like a Rorschach test, Rorschach blot. You can like see what you want in it, and it's playful. Like that's part. There's a playfulness in that ambiguity as well.
I love that. Oh, this is amazing. That might be a perfect way to end kind of thinking about this. Thank you. This is Chaim Gingold, the author of Building SimCity, How to Put the World in a Machine. This is fantastic. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, Sam.